Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Although we're getting a late start today, I bring you a topic of different historical issues that I like to discuss and think that are important to a general discussion and things like that. And because I can't get to these topics during my Q&As because we've got so many great people asking questions, I decided last fall that we would have a live stream lecture every Sunday. So Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, instead of answering all of your questions related to history and social studies, I present a particular historical topic to you. And today I am proud to present the Dutch Republic and the Dutch Golden Age. We'll be talking about the Netherlands in the 17th century, how they broke free of Catholic yoke, and as a Protestant and Calvinist country, one of the most prominent in Europe, their Republican experiment actually was extraordinarily successful, and all of that great stuff. So we will be discussing the importance and significance and the impact of one of the most well-known republics that you probably have never heard about, one of the most successful European enterprises and mercantile empires that you've probably never heard about, and that is the Dutch Republic. Where they came from, what they did, and how they changed the narrative in Europe permanently, and how the Dutch were the wealthiest and most successful empire, or at least kingdom, or country in Western Europe in the 17th century for many very different reasons. So I hope you guys really enjoy that. It's not really me answering your questions, so I hope you guys behave yourselves in the chat and enjoy yourself. Hars is here. Great to see you as always. He's going to be moderating the chat and everything, so make sure to put in the social medias, Hars, so that you guys can follow me on social medias like Instagram, Facebook, X, Patreon, Substack, all of those great places as I bring you a presentation and a discussion about the Dutch Republic, one of the most important and interesting topics that I've been wanting to get to for a while and finally am doing. Let me make a distinction that a lot of people do not make. A lot of people refer to the Dutch, the Netherlands, and Holland interchangeably, and we're going to be kind of fixing that understanding about that. And basically, let me start off by saying that the Dutch are the group of people who occupy this region of the world. The Dutch were part of originally a land called Flanders that was owned interchangeably by the French and the Holy Roman Empire. They developed their own culture and language in many of their cities like Antwerp, Amsterdam, Leiden, and The Hague. And they are one of the most formidable, creative, and lucrative people in history, and we will definitely be seeing that with the story of the Dutch Republic. But the Dutch are the people that live in the Netherlands. Holland is a particular county in the Netherlands. It's one of the provinces in that area that has a particularly rich and culturally relevant history. You think of tulips and the green pastures, the verdant knolls and mounds, and those incredible windmills. That's Holland. Holland is one of the largest counties and areas in the Netherlands to this day, and is probably the most historically and culturally relevant, but the Netherlands and Holland are not interchangeable. There have also been different types of Netherlands. There are the regular Netherlands, which are occupied and controlled by the Dutch, and that will be what we are talking about when we talk about the Dutch Republic. Then there are the Spanish Netherlands, which were controlled by Spain until the 18th century, and then there are the Austrian Netherlands, which were controlled by Austria. Eventually, all of the Netherlands was united, and in 1815, following the defeat of Napoleon, a part of the Austrian Netherlands was cut out to be a borderland between France and Germany, and that became the country of Belgium. So that is where Belgium comes from. That's a little bit on the Netherlands, and a distinction between the Dutch, the Netherlands, and Holland. I will be mainly referring to the Netherlands and to the Dutch Republic that was in the Netherlands. When I talk about the Netherlands, I'm talking about the land of the Dutch people, Holland being one of those counties. So hello, sit back and enjoy me discussing the Dutch Republic in my live stream lecture that we do every Sunday. If you like history and social studies, you're probably in the right place. Consider liking, subscribing, and becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as that. I will not be doing interacting with the chat as much, so please behave yourselves, have a good discussion, share some comments, and maybe at the end, if I get through most of a topic, I will be able to do interact and do some Q&A. But welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. This is History Hefner, bringing you friendly neighborhood history 24/7, 365, or 366. And if you like history and social studies, I believe you are in the right place. So I will be discussing, again, the Dutch Republic and the rise of the Dutch mercantile empire in the 17th century. So that land had originally been part of Hapsburg Europe. The Hapsburgs were an extraordinarily powerful family that were simultaneously the dukes and duchesses of Austria, the kings and queens of Spain, and Portugal for a time, and the Holy Roman Emperors. And this was all during the 16th century when they were extraordinarily powerful. Men like Charles V and Philip II ruled over vast kingdoms that included lands in Italy, Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands. The Spanish were the most powerful kingdom in Europe at the time because they had developed a New World Empire in the 16th century that had conquered the Aztecs, Incas, and many other native groups to create the Spanish New World Empire in North, Central, and South America that spread Catholicism and Spanish culture to that area while intermarrying with the natives and making Spain extraordinarily rich, relying on the work of natives and slaves from Africa to basically harvest silver, gold, precious metals, and different types of cash crops like tobacco and sugar and things like that. The power and wealth of the Spanish kings and the Hapsburgs made them the most powerful family in all of Europe. They were the most powerful empire in all of Europe. They were the most populous empire in all of Europe. And they were able to basically bully their way over any of their opponents. This allowed them to capture lands like Sicily, Naples, and of course, the Netherlands. So you've got the rulers of Austria, the rulers of Spain, and the people who were usually the prime candidates for the Holy Roman Emperor, who was an elected position at the time, dominating this area called the Netherlands. This rise of the Spanish and their extremely powerful empire ruled by the Hapsburg family, one of Europe's most famous royal families, coincided with the rise of the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century, which directly opposed the Habsburgs and their loyalty to the Catholic Church and their continual desire to impress upon the Pope as much of their power and influence as possible. The Protestants the rise of the Protestant Reformation began in Germany in what was called the Holy Roman Empire, thanks to the work of Martin Luther and his main religious patron, Frederick the Wise, one of the German princes and electors. Protestant Lutheranism became quite popular in the Netherlands and then or in Germany, and then spread to the lowlands, including the Netherlands. However, Protestant theology in the later half of the 16th century was more influenced by the works by Swiss reformers such as John Calvin and his teachings about God. Basically, just as a quick aside, the Protestant Reformation emphasized the reading of Scripture independently, salvation by faith in Christ alone. They got rid of the Pope, a belief in purgatory, veneration, and prayer to the saints, all common Catholic customs both then and now, and embraced a more personalized religion that had a more direct relationship with God directly through Christ instead of using the church as a means to salvation. Salvation was now an independent thing that was handled by the person through his or her ability to read the scriptures and understand what God was saying to them. The proliferation of the printing press allowed Luther's writings, as well as the writings of other Protestant reformers like John Calvin and the Bible, to become much more commonplace throughout all of Western Europe in the languages of the native peoples. And this spread to the Dutch, who at this time they spoke, as many people in Europe to this day, spoke multiple European languages, including French and German. So the influence on the Dutch came primarily from the Swiss reformers. Ulrich Zwingli was the original Swiss reformer, and eventually John Calvin became the predominant leader of the Swiss reformers in the 1540s, 50s, and 60s. Calvin taught one of a stronger, more poignant types of Reformation theology called Reformed theology or Calvinism, the idea that God had not only had no place for the papacy, had no place for Catholic ideas, and only wanted his people to read the Bible and have a personal relationship with him, but that God had chosen who would be saved, and God had determined whatever happened in the world. So whatever had happened was actually because God had said this is what's going to happen, and he was sovereign and in charge, so he couldn't be countered, and humans were only saved or damned because of God's desire and design. This ideology, which relied heavily on putting God on the ultimate platform, while also a rather humiliating and low form of the human will, believing it was heavily damaged by sin and depravity, became popular amongst Protestants looking to stake out a claim against the Roman Catholic Church in the lowlands. So in the Netherlands in the mid-16th century, the Calvinist ideas of John Calvin spread there and became very popular amongst Protestants who were consistently being persecuted by the Catholics in Spain who controlled that land. Certain Dutch princes and rulers like William I, the Prince of Orange, embraced Calvinism and embraced Protestant theology, seeing it as a great way to countermand the Catholic Church and the Hapsburgs who had made them chafe under them. Many princes and lords and rulers embraced Protestantism as a way to get out from continual taxation requirements to the Holy Roman Emperor or to the papacy, and believing that they could claim more power and individual rights for themselves and their own people. They stalked out on their own to try to make their own, try to basically embrace Protestantism and then bring the people, their constituents, into the Protestant fold as well. And this was all extraordinarily popular and interesting during that time period. And William of Orange was one such man who heavily fell under the influence of Protestantism. And in 1568, the Dutch Revolt began. This would turn into a long war. It would happen on and off for 60 years, called the 80 Years' War. From 1568 to 1648, the Netherlands, both the Spanish and Dutch occupied areas, would fight against the Spanish in a revolt, as the Dutch people did everything in their power to throw off the yoke of the Spanish Hapsburgs and the Catholic Church, as more and more of the Netherlands embraced Calvinistic theology, Reformed theology, and Protestantism. The rise in Protestantism and things like this may undermine the Catholic Church, but it also undermined Habsburg authority, and the Habsburgs weren't having any of it. Spain was ruled at this time by a man named Philip II, who was also constantly fighting with the English and doing everything he could to bring Europe back to the Catholic fold after many European countries had abandoned Catholicism, embracing Protestant and Reformed theology. So, for decades, fighting in Spain, between Spain and Portugal, would be common, and it wasn't until the 1580s that the Dutch had enough of a foothold on their own lands in what is now the Netherlands, in the northern part. So there's the south, which was the Spanish Netherlands, which I mentioned before, and the north, which are the Dutch Netherlands. And this area gained autonomy by the 1580s by basically fighting raucously and often to basically throw off the yoke of the Spanish Habsburgs. This vociferous amount of fighting eventually forced the Spanish to recognize the Dutch as having their own republic and having their own Protestant beliefs. Rather than being ruled by princes like William of Orange, the Dutch established a republic where the principalities were restricted by the actions of republican governments. So they had representatives, they had voters, they had a parliament, and all of these things that restricted the powers of all princes in their region, and they didn't have a king to unify them. So it wasn't a constitutional monarchy, but a republican government with powerful princes and dukes on the side. This led to the growth of very important cities in the region. The most important region and county in the Netherlands was Holland, which is why to this day people confuse the Netherlands and Holland all the time. Holland is part of the Netherlands. The Netherlands is much bigger than just Holland, however. But important cities like Amsterdam, the capital, Antwerp, and Rotterdam grew up, and these became important cities. Rotterdam was a huge port city, and the Dutch Republic, which had very little land compared to their neighbors in the Holy Roman Empire, France, England, and Spain, relied instead on seafaring and trade in order to make ends meet, seeing themselves immediately as a mercantile empire. They did everything they could. They built some of the best ships, frigates, galleons, and trade ships, transport ships, carracks, very fast ships that were already had been very successfully used by the Spanish earlier in the 16th century to travel around the Western Hemisphere, were now used by the Dutch to trade anywhere they could in Europe and in Asia. And this would be so Rotterdam would become, and Amsterdam would become huge centers of Dutch seamanship and seafaring, and help them build a mercantile empire that was extraordinarily wealthy and became extraordinarily expansive in the early 17th century. And yes, Antwerp is Belgian, but at the time this was all part of the Netherlands because Belgium didn't exist until the 19th century. So the Spanish continued to hold on to the Spanish Netherlands, and continual outbreaks of fighting would be quite common. Meanwhile, the Dutch themselves were extraordinarily committed to Reformed theology and Calvinism throughout the late part of the 16th century and the early part of their existence. Part of the Calvinistic work ethos was, because God was in complete control of the universe and had created a universe of order that he had determined every single action, people needed to be diligent, hardworking people in order to show that they were honoring God and that they were true Christians. Because God had picked who was going to be saved, you needed to prove that you were saved by your outward actions as a sign of the salvation that God had chosen you for. In order to do this, you needed to work very diligently, be very ethical, very honest, and very responsible, and that it definitely defines the Dutch, from their craftsmanship, which was extraordinarily important to them, building many ships like the carracks and galleons I mentioned earlier, to banking, financial institutions that were already quite popular in Switzerland, but then made their way to the Dutch in the Netherlands. The Dutch were extraordinarily diligent under these Calvinist auspices, employing a work ethic that wanted them to show that they were among the chosen that God had decided would inherit eternal life. This Christian theology, of course, had its downsides. The Dutch were known for their strident beliefs, following many of Calvin's ideas. They did not celebrate Christmas or Easter because they were not directly related, or they did celebrate Easter. They did not celebrate Christmas because it wasn't in the Bible. They also did not celebrate, they did not dance. Many of them were teetotalers. And there was just this overall commitment to ethical behavior that powered the Dutch, made them extraordinarily efficient, just as the Swiss had become extraordinarily efficient in their craftsmanship and artisan work. The Dutch did the same thing. So this is the early days of the Dutch Empire, of the Dutch Republic in the 16th century. And the reason I keep calling it an empire is because the Dutch, despite never having huge amounts of land in Europe compared to the likes of France, Russia, Great Britain, or Germany, held vast amounts of influence and colonies overseas that we will talk about in a minute. So you have the 80 Years' War going on. One of the wars within the 80 Years' War is called the 8 Years' War, and it was at this point that the Dutch were able to claim their full autonomy from the Spanish, but because they lost the war technically, they gave up any claims to the Spanish Netherlands, which would later become the Austrian Netherlands and be the basis of what is now modern-day Belgium. However, important cities like Amsterdam, and continual intermittent fighting was the pattern between the Dutch and the Spanish. And in 1618, war would break out between all of the Europeans in what's called the 30 Years' War, in which the Dutch and the Spanish fighting in that war also, of course, involved the fighting in the Holy Roman Empire, the Swedish, the Danish, the Polish, and the French. So that would be, and the Austrians. And that would last, of course, for 30 years. By the end of that 30 Years' War, the Spanish gave up all claims they had whatsoever to all of the Netherlands and allowed the Dutch Republic to unite all of the Netherlands under its banner for a time. So, until the Austrians would take the Austrian Netherlands. It's confusing. The Europeans love to shift power and take land from each other until they got into other areas where they were able to take land from other people. So, where does this put the Dutch? This high emphasis on hard work and craftsmanship, good ethics, and honesty leads to the development of a strong educational underbelly. Protestant and Calvinist and Reformed denominations and groups of Christians were well known for their diligence in education and in educating the masses. With the accessibility of the printing press, the demands for higher education for both men and women, but men especially, became a predominant theme of Protestantism, and especially Calvinistic Protestantism, which again emphasized doing their due diligence to education. So the proper education of men and women became part of what was common. Apprenticeships were the way that most people were educated. Someone would have some form of basic formal schooling, usually a man, and by the time he got to be 12 or 13, he would be apprenticed to work under someone who was an expert in the trade, a blacksmith or a tanner or a craftsman or a carpenter or someone like that, and that's how someone would learn. So apprenticeship was quite common in those days, but higher education was also of a high importance for the Dutch and the Dutch Calvinists, and that is why the University of Leiden became one of the most important universities in Europe for the development of mathematics, science, history, and literature, and many great scientists, mathematicians, and thinkers went through those universities like René Descartes, Anton de Leeuwenhoek, and of course, the greatest artist in perhaps all of history, if not certainly Dutch history, and certainly during the 17th century, Rembrandt van Rijn, who became one of the greatest artists ever. So this was all of those men I just mentioned, all of the great art of the Dutch painters, the landscape portraiture, which I will be discussing shortly, is all a product of the Dutch Golden Age. So you've got developments in education, you have developments in work ethic, you have developments in seamanship and craftsmanship. You have the desire to trade and to spread your influence and ideas all over the world because you're a very small area, but you have a large amount of sea accessible to you in what's called the North Sea. The North Sea, by the way, goes from the northwestern point of the Netherlands all the way up northward, and is the amount of sea separating England and Scotland in the west from the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries of Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and Denmark in the east. So the Dutch were extraordinarily interested in seafaring and sea trade, and this would become the linchpin of their success and their great wealth during the 17th century. Again, you've got a republic with representative government. You have a lot of men having the right to vote, the right to own businesses. You have apprenticeships, quite common. This is a very, very profitable time, and a very, very diligent and what would be the good word? Productive time to live in for many of the Dutch people, for men and women alike. However, as time goes on and as religious revivals start to decrease in their influence and power, the Dutch Republic and eventually the Dutch Sea Empire will become more well known for its economic and social achievements, its scientific achievements, than its religious conservatism and religious fervor. By the time the Pilgrims, who were separatists from the Church of England, who went to live in the Netherlands, believing that they could live under actual Calvinist government and flourish there, arrived in the early 17th century, they were heartbroken at how the religious revival had simmered down, and how it wasn't nearly as strong and markedly Calvinist and religiously diligent as it had supposedly been in the decades before. By this time, the Dutch Republic was far more interested in its economic and mercantile achievements than it was in its religious reform, which had made it one of the most which had given it its distinctive marks and been one of the short linchpins for its continual revolt against the Spanish and the Catholic Hapsburgs. So what's interesting is this religious cooling and lukewarmness that was prevalent in the early 17th century would give rise to a religious religious reform as an answer to Calvinism, known as the Remonstrants, who became quite popular in the Dutch around in the Netherlands in the early 17th century. By 1619, the Remonstrants was an answer to Calvinism that basically believed that human beings had free will and God could not choose who he wanted to be saved. This division amongst the Dutch intensified their fighting against the Catholic Spanish and reopened the wounds of the 80 Years' War, which continued to be waged all throughout all of this time. So the religious reform that had been so important to the rebellion of the Dutch was cooling. The commitment to Calvinism and Reformed theology was not what it had been in the 1570s and 80s, and by the 1610s, it was clear that the Dutch were not as religiously fervent as they had, and this led to religious division and different Christian groups trying to assume different political power, with infighting allowing the Spanish to gain an upper hand for a while in the continual Dutch revolt. Yet Dutch culture continued to flourish. The University of Leiden, as I mentioned before, produced some of the greatest scientists and thinkers of the time, with people like Descartes, Leeuwenhoek, Christian Huygens, who created, as a good Calvinist, the first clock system. And, of course, Tycho Brahe, one of the greatest astronomers of all time. These were all products of the University of Leiden and the Dutch Republic and the Dutch Golden Age of the early 17th century. Speaking of for the art, Rembrandt obviously is perhaps the greatest painter of all time and is certainly the greatest Dutch artist of all time. And he came to dominate that artistic period that was already popular in other parts of Europe called the Baroque. The Dutch painters, the Dutch school of art, which was more than just Rembrandt, it included great painters like Jan Vermeer, who made the girl with the pearl earring, Jan van Eyck, Hans Holbein, Jan Vermeer, and Peter Bruegel, as well as others, was consumed not with religious imagery, despite their deep Protestant and Calvinist convictions. More so, they were, although Rembrandt did paint many religious images, they were extraordinarily interested and invested in secular art And by secular art, I don't mean anti-religious art, but in art that depicted people in ordinary circumstances living ordinary lives. The girl with the pearl earring is a great example of this. There's paintings of women literally just in the kitchen cooking. There's paintings of fruit bowls and things like that. These are all a product that are very famous in the artistic world and in the artistic tradition. These are all very realistic, beautiful, vivid prints of average ordinary life of anyone, any common chambermaid, wife, sister, daughter, family in the Dutch Republic in the early and mid 17th century. Portraits were also extremely important as the paintings of ordinary people or even high-ranking people in society became more and more of a cherished possession in the 17th century art. And you couldn't get better than the Dutch. Hans Holbein had already, and others had already established the Dutch. I think Holbein was actually from Germany, but it was definitely a huge influence on the Dutch. These were all these were all extraordinarily important and influential artists of the 16th and 17th century, and they focused on regular people living regular lives, painting portraits of important and less than important individuals. There's beautiful paintings of landscapes, of the countryside, of nature. In the wake of humanist philosophy that was common in the 1500s and of this emphasis on the human being and their relationship to God, which was a total product of the Protestant Reformation and the Calvinism that came out of that, many of the artists of the period were very intent on painting human beings in normal, ordinary circumstances, living life in their cities or their towns, painting the landscapes in which they lived and walked around, where they fished and hunted, and things of that nature. I should have saved a few of the paintings and images and shown you, but these are all products of the Dutch Golden Age of Dutch art at that time, and it is extraordinarily beautiful, if you ask me. So that's a little bit there. The biggest accomplishment and perhaps the thing the Dutch are the most famous for, other than the beautiful masterpieces of Rembrandt, the common ordinary landscape paintings and portraiture of the likes of Van Dyck, and Bugel and Jan Vermeer, is the Dutch mercantile empire that they built starting in the early 17th century. Again, with great ports like Rotterdam and Amsterdam being extremely important places where the building of craftsmanship was extremely important, apprentices for craftsmanship were extremely important. I also have to mention medical science made a lot of advancements. The study of biology, anatomy, things like this were very, very common in Holland and in other areas of the Netherlands, where the study of the human body that was made by God and was supposed to be committed to the glorification of God according to Calvinist theology was extremely important. And once again, even with the religious theme starting to wane and people starting to be weighed down by religious indifferentism, the commitment to good work ethic, to creating masterpieces and diligency remained extremely important for the Dutch during the early 17th century. So, the craftsmanship, the creation of ships, carracks, galleons, and other extremely important buoyant and reliable vessels were the marked jewel in the crown of the Dutch Golden Age. If the Dutch are known for anything for what they did in the 17th century, it is indeed their ability to travel all around the world and greatly influence the trade patterns around them. So the building of these ships turned places like Rotterdam and Amsterdam into huge ports with huge harbors, with businesses, companies, money exchanges, banks, all of them ready to trade and unpack goods that were exported and imported into the country, making the Dutch consistently wealthy in that they always had the ability to trade, and their ships were the fastest, the most well-managed and captained, with some of the best pilots in all of Europe working explicitly for the Dutch despite their different backgrounds. Henry Hudson is a great example of this, who I will talk about in a minute. The Dutch were ready to go. This craftsmanship, this diligency had all paid off for them, and the ability of them to create massive ships, warships, trade ships, transport ships, all different types of naval vessels and mercantile vessels that would allow them to travel at great speeds for the time and move around the world pretty respectably, outdoing the Portuguese and Spanish, who had been the best at traveling and trading via ship before them. So the Dutch would get involved in all sorts of trade that was all over the world. They were already very well aware of the trade with the Western world, with the Western Hemisphere. The colonization of that area by the Spanish was of important renown. It was infuriating to many Protestants in Europe, even as the religious wars of the 1500s gave way to more religious indifferentism in the 1600s, and even after the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War ended in 1648, Protestants continued to chafe under the idea that most of the world was being actively proselytized by Spanish and Portuguese Catholics, and the Jesuits especially, a certain religious order of Catholic priests and missionaries which were spreading Catholic education and ideas west and east and everywhere. The fear of the continual growing influence of Catholicism and the growing wealth and power of Spain and Portugal made Protestant powers like England and the Dutch Republic tremble. So the Dutch decided to put all of their diligence into trade, piloting ships, and going around the world in their own way. And so starting in 1603, the VOC, or the Dutch India Company, was chartered by the Dutch Republic as a trade company that could go around the world trading with different countries, bringing back goods and creating a cultural exchange and creating new markets and new in other harbors and foreign ports, and eventually colonizing certain areas. So the Dutch got in the game and they hit the ground running. They had the fastest ships and the best piloted ships in the world, and this allowed them to catch up quickly to the Spanish and the Portuguese, who had influence and connections all throughout the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the Atlantic. So this came in several different examples. One of them was colonization. In the 1660s, the Dutch, under the pilotship of a man named Henry Hudson, who was an Englishman, arrived in New Amsterdam, what they would call New Amsterdam, encountering a group of Native Americans in the New World and establishing their colony there. The Native American group they encountered, they named the island after. The island was Manhattan. So New York was originally New Amsterdam, which was actually settled and originally navigated by an Englishman working for the Dutch, Henry Hudson, and that's why the river next to New York is called the Hudson River. And the first Dutch settlements were set up there, once again with a commitment, at least ostensibly, to Calvinist Reformed Christian principles, much like the Plymouth colonies had been when they were settled by the same pilgrims who had left the Dutch in the 1610s because they believed they were not Christian enough. They weren't hardcore enough in their beliefs. So setting aside the difference between Calvinists and Remonstrants and their continual hatred of Catholicism, as well as their desire to become wealthy, powerful, and influential, motivated the Dutch, as it would motivate anyone, to settle other lands, and this led to the settlement of New York, Peter Struveut being one of the first leaders of the Dutch colonies there. And this would actually bring the Dutch into conflict with the English. I believe it was in the 1640s this happened. But in the 1660s, a series of naval wars would eventually lead the English to seizing New Amsterdam and taking it from the Dutch, as rival Protestant countries put aside their religious connections in order to fight for land, power, and influence. And it's called New York because it was gifted to the brother of the King of England, James, who was the Duke of York. So it was renamed New York. New Jersey was also taken, as a matter of fact. So the Dutch didn't kind of struck out when it came to settling North America, but for a few decades had a stranglehold on perhaps one of the most important areas in all of what is now the United States, Manhattan and the 5 boroughs of New York. I believe they gave most of the boroughs their names. I think Bronx does indeed come from that. The English changed the names around. But anyways, so after that, failure in the Western Hemisphere was countermanded by huge success in the Eastern Hemisphere. And basically, the Spanish, who had dominated the Western Hemisphere, had been countermanded by the Portuguese, who had dominated trade, influence, and cultural exchange in the Eastern Hemisphere. The Dutch themselves quickly got involved in the slave trade in Africa, which had been monopolized for a long time by the Portuguese, but by the time the Dutch arrived in the 1600s, the French, the British, although the British didn't exist, the French, the English, and the Spanish were all very much involved and aware of the slave trade, and the Dutch themselves got involved in that as well for their new colonies in New Amsterdam and then in the East Indies. By the way, the West Indies are the Caribbean, so those areas, and some of those lands were actually claimed by the Dutch, including the Virgin Islands for a time. And the East Indies are places like Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Siam, Singapore. So, thank you, Freshly, for holding down the order. So what happens next? The Dutch sail around the Cape of Good Hope, around South Africa, and eventually they become predominant trading partners in the Indian Ocean, challenging the authority of the Portuguese. They trade consistently, bringing their craftsman merchandise, their incredible works of architecture, carpentry, pewter. They would love to work with metals and blacksmithery and silversmithery to create beautiful dishes and plates. I mean, it's called the Dutch oven for a reason. The Dutch were extraordinarily good at inventing very, very practical household appliances. So the trading of these appliances, this craftsman work, this carpentry, was extraordinarily popular in Africa and in Asia, and it allowed them to open up markets trading with the Indians, with people in what is now Myanmar and Malaysia, Macau. Areas like that were all extraordinarily important ports for the Portuguese, and the Dutch soon challenged the Portuguese. This challenge led to a series of naval conflicts in the area, but Dutch influence continued to grow, and they eventually got their major colonial acquisition. As small as the Netherlands is compared to France, Britain, and Germany, the Dutch did indeed have their own imperialistic ambitions and were successful in swallowing up and imperializing certain areas. The most notable of all these areas was Indonesia, which was colonized by the Dutch, I think, in the late 1600s and was controlled until the 1940s, until the Japanese took over those lands during this, what I call the Third World War, what you call the Second World War, and afterwards, thanks to the efforts of a man named Sukarno and others, the Dutch were not only were the Japanese thrown out, but the Dutch were thrown out of Indonesia as well. So what's fascinating too is the Dutch connection to the Japanese and the Chinese. So connections with Malaysia and India would eventually lead, as it did for the Portuguese and the English and the Spanish, to connections with China and Japan, which bypassing the Silk Road, which would have gone right through the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant Christians, like all Christians, aren't very interested in doing that. The Dutch found themselves using their extremely good ships to arrive in far eastern ports like Hong Kong, and eventually find their way to Japan. The most obvious port, there were two ports, Kyushu and of all places, Nagasaki. Nanjing was one of the most popular trading ports with the Chinese, Shanghai as well. And so the Dutch were consistently doing this, but not as much as the Portuguese had before them and the British would do later on. But they had their day in the sun, becoming the predominant traders with China, India, and Japan. Japan, for its part, was very, very leery because of the continual influence of the Portuguese. The Portuguese, the Portuguese, I'm trying to remember. The Portuguese had tried to spread Catholicism to Japan. This had led to a lot of religious and political conflicts. And with the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who became the shogun or supreme warlord of Japan in 1603, Christianity soon found itself on the outs. Particularly Catholic Christianity, as the Portuguese and the Jesuits became the primary enemy of the Tokugawa shogunate, who was a little bit more favorable to Protestant Christianity and to the Dutch. Now, a lot of this has been highly fictionalized in James Clavell's incredibly good novel, Shogun, which obviously became the Hulu series that won the Emmys this last couple years. But there is a lot of truth to it. There were indeed encounters between English sailors for the Dutch who did help the Japanese defeat the Portuguese, and the Tokugawa Ieyasu helped him become the shogun. Because of the good status and relationship of the Dutch, and because the Dutch had no affinity for the Portuguese, when the Portuguese were kicked out, when the Catholic Church was driven underground in Japan, and when Christianity was banned and all foreign trade was banned by 1645, the Tokugawa shogunate was only favorable to one group of Europeans. That was the Dutch. This allowed the Dutch trade to flourish more than any. They had a monopoly on trade with most East Asian countries. They had become extraordinarily wealthy through this. They had colonies in the New World. They had colonies in the East Indies, most notably Indonesia, which is extraordinarily more populous than the Netherlands ever has been. And they had the Spanish off their backs. So the truth of the matter is, by the mid-17th century, the Dutch were sitting really, really pretty. They had the best university, and when it came to Leiden, they had the greatest artworks like Rembrandt, of course, and also Vermeer and Bruegel and others. They had extensively traded in both the Western and Eastern hemispheres. They had gotten involved in colonizing India and the New World, and although those colonies would come to end, their control over Indonesia would last for centuries. And they had monopolies on trade in East Asia, particularly with the Japanese, which made them extraordinarily wealthy. Dutch sailors were also some of the first to go around the continent of Australia, citing the famous Black Swan incident. They never really settled Australia, but their expansive reach into the East Indies made the VOC, the Dutch India Company, the most successful trading company in the world, rivaled only by the East India Trading Company, which the British would later create. So, thank you, Freshly, for handling the chat, by the way. I appreciate that, but you don't have to delete. I don't know what messages you're deleting, but anyways. So, what happened? How did this end? And how did the Dutch go from being the predominant mercantile empire with huge amounts of trade, influence, and colonies in the mid-17th century to being a minuscule power by the 19th century? Well, the Austrian Netherlands happened. The Rundpranger in 1672 brought about the end of the Dutch Republic. William of Orange leaving his lands in Holland to take over England in the late 17th century weakened them. And with the rise of England and France and the defeat of the Dutch Navy at the hands of the rising English Navy, the Dutch lost their Western Hemisphere territories. France and England's continual rising influence in India eventually saw the Dutch basically kicked out and the VOC lose a lot of its influence and wealth. The fervor of the previous decades for creativity on religious grounds didn't seem to carry on as much as it had, and religious divisions between the Remonstrants and the Calvinists continued to divide the Church of the Netherlands and the Dutch Reform. Although the Dutch Reformed Church would become one of the most predominant Christian religions in Western Europe and in the United States. So, as the decline of the Qing dynasty and the Tokugawa shogunate in the 18th and 19th centuries would leave the Dutch with fewer and fewer returns on their continual monopolies. Eventually, the colonization of Africa would have the Dutch basically lose all of the influence that they had in that area. And so the Dutch did not have the extreme amount of influence in Africa that even their new neighbors, the Belgians, had in controlling the Congo. Meanwhile, of course, the British, French, Italians, they all got involved in that. And as time went on, the Dutch did not have the large military or political structure necessary. They did not have large amounts of land and productivity during the Industrial Revolution to rival France, Great Britain, and Germany, and their navy, which had supplanted the Portuguese as one of the best and most expansive in the world, was then supplanted by the English in the 1700s. So the Dutch Republic and the Dutch Golden Age, although extraordinarily impressive for its scientific, religious, economic, social, political, and military advancements, was quite short-lived when you compare it to the great influence of the British Empire, which would have basically all the same things, but in a deeper way. So, Harry, I think you might enjoy hearing that. But obviously, it's an extraordinarily influential thing. A huge amount of early Americans were of Dutch ancestry. New York itself was founded as a Dutch colony and then taken by the English. New York would not have developed into the important port city that it was if it had not originally been charted by Henry Hudson and the Dutch. The boroughs would not be there without the Dutch. Indonesia's extreme influence on world trade and world events would not have happened without the Dutch Republic and its settlement of those areas. The Dutch Reformed, as I mentioned, would be an extremely influential Protestant denomination in Western Europe and the United States. There's a lot that the Dutch have contributed socially and culturally that continue to be quite influential to this day, showing that Holland is more than just its windmills, and the Dutch Republic is more than just one of the first and earliest successes of Republican government in the Western world. It was an empire with great mercantile reach, extraordinarily advanced social systems, and a very diligent work ethic that made it, for a time in the 1600s and the 17th century, the envy of most other Western European nations. The fascinating part of the 1600s in European history is that the two predominant mercantile and military powers, respectively, were the Dutch and the Polish. And very few people know about that, and very few people remember that. They remember the British, they remember the French, they remember the Russians. But for a time, the Dutch were the most powerful and most impressive force in Western Europe. So anyways, that is a quick story, about 40 minutes long, a lecture on the Dutch Republic. Obviously, I missed a few things, and there's obviously more that I could possibly go on about, but I hope you enjoyed that story of the rise, the legacy, and the fall of the Dutch Republic and the Dutch mercantile empire that they had in the 17th century and throughout the 1600s. And it also fills in a lot of gaps about Asian history, Western European history, the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, and other things that were, because history is a tapestry that goes in all sorts of weaves and patterns, and it's all connected to each other at the end of the day. So we've got about 15 minutes left. Usually I go about an hour or so. So I will take whatever questions you have about the Dutch Republic or any other historical topic, give you guys a little bonus. 15 minutes of history can make you 15%. What is it? 15 minutes can save you 15%. 15 minutes of history with me can make you 15% smarter. There you go. So if you enjoyed what I talked about and what I shared about Dutch history, consider liking and subscribing. If you have questions about history and social studies, I will be happy to answer them. We've got about 15 minutes or so, so thank you very much for joining and listening. You may go if you'd like, but if you have questions or want to hear me talk about more history with other people asking great questions, feel free to stay. I really appreciate everybody spending their late Sunday afternoon with me here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Thank you for joining us, John from Ireland. That's wonderful. Harry's from Great Britain, so we get people from all over the world. It's really fun. Christensen, are those the fortresses that they built off the coast of Africa so that they could easily wheel and deal in the slave trade? I seem to recall something like that. Let me see here. And I see that Harry, or Freshly went freshly crazy with the chat. Great job. And yes, Freshly's absolutely right. Double tap the screen and please subscribe. Hars, did you put in the social media handles? You guys can get more updates and information, including my Patreon and my Substack there. We don't have freedom of religion USA. Of all the places in the world that have freedom of religion, it's definitely the USA. I did look into the Wetzel brothers. I looked into Louis Wetzel, and he was one of the most fierce Indian hunters and slayers in U.S. history, if I've got the right Wetzels. I believe his brother was also very involved in that. They were basically hired by the U.S. government to be contract killers of Native Americans. Oh, interesting. I don't know a huge amount about them. I've heard about them before. I imagine they built them for defense from enemy naval attacks. What's the least known time in human history? I think the 1600s don't get what I just talked about, Kevin. At least when it comes to European history, don't get the love and attention that they need. You do. I heard a podcast on them. I thought you'd find it interesting. If you want to, Robin Hood, email me. You guys can always email me with feedback, comments, suggestions, or if you want to have a longer conversation about a particular topic, I'm happy to do that. Could somebody please put the social media, the email, all of that? I know M's here. I know Hars is here. Freshly's here. If you guys could put the social media and the email in the chat, that would be very, very helpful. Thank you for joining us from Poland. Great to see you. LeBron, I'm so glad that you are here. Let me see here. Thank you for loving my content, Paul. I really appreciate that. You got your shout out. Tugon Mai. Paul, you are welcome. Thank you so much. Let me see here. Have you watched the H3 Hassan Israel-Palestine debate? I heard a little bit about it. That was quite interesting. Hassan Parker, yeah. Let me see here, just looking for the chat, trying to answer as many questions as I can. If you have a question, please put it in the chat about the Dutch Republic, preferably, but about any historical topic, I'll be happy to oblige. Derek, I am already a teacher, but I really appreciate that. Thank you, Nofro, for subscribing. And Herbert, if you love history, you're in the right place. Make sure to like and subscribe. Let me see here. John saying the Dutch King Billy had a battle in Ireland. Oh, yeah, the Dutch at one point, I believe they were... it was some sort of treaty or agreement, and I've never figured out, but the rumor is they actually cannibalized their own prime minister as some sort of agreement or some sort of desperate act when they were under siege. I'm trying to remember what it was. What's the best conspiracy theory I've ever heard? There's a lot of them. I used to think the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy theory till I realized that was definitely not the truth. And I don't think it's Friendly Neighborhood History 1. I think it's just friendlyneighborhoodhistory@gmail.com. But thank you, M, my wonderful moderator, for putting that in the chat. Let me see. Isn't Venice considered the best republic ever? It had royalty, oligarchy, and representative government. Yeah, the Venetians had an early republic. The Dutch had an extraordinarily successful republic that not a lot of people know about. And just like the Venetians, their republic allowed their principalities to have the political authority and military prowess that they did, like William of Orange, who became the King of England, but also they are the King of Britain, almost Britain at that point, England and Scotland. And the Venetians had that in for a while under the leadership of the Doge system. Yes, Dodge. These were Italian princes and duchess, dukes of different duchies in the late Middle Ages. I don't know how representative it was. Yeah, the VOC topped out at one of the richest in history. Yeah, actually, Harry, I think that you guys copied the Dutch. Why after we took the Dutch Empire over twice did we give it back the 2 times? In 1815, the Dutch were given back their land after Napoleon, and Belgium was taken from them and given that. It was considered a balance of power after the Napoleonic Wars in 19th century Europe, where no power was allowed to get too controlling, be it the British, the French, or the Germans, or the Russians. Therefore, the continent could have a balance of powers. In 1945, it was returning the empire that they wanted because the Dutch had fought bitterly against the Germans in both world wars of the 20th century and had lost both times. So, yeah, Harry, that's kind of where that comes from. Let me see here. My best conspiracy theory, though, Myrtle. Oh, that's a good one. My best conspiracy theory. I don't have a conspiracy theory that I think I naturally believe in, but I find some to be interesting. Hollow Earth. The hollow Earth theory that there are humans, that there is actually habitable lands underneath the Earth. Totally been bonkers, but really interesting. Was there one parliament for all the princes and dukes, or one parliament for each prince and duke in the Netherlands? I think there was one main parliament. I'm not sure exactly. I believe they are built with sacred geometry and were more than just city defense, the engine it generated. Yeah, they were extraordinarily fastidious, and that would be an example of their fastidiousness. Christensen. Nixon's unconstitutional targeting religious practices kill human, environmental, and animals and bear. Nixon? Nixon created the EPA. A lot of people don't know that. Yeah, I will launch an inquiry into the freshly dictatorship of the chat. But at least he's telling people to like and subscribe. I appreciate that. Thank you for joining us from Newcastle. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Indigenous religious practices are unconstitutionally targeted. Nearly 70 years of cultural genocide. USA government agencies stigmatize holy medicine crops. Yes, that is a travesty and a shame and should not happen. So I agree with you there, 600 Plant Life. Hello, Isaiah. I am good. I hope you are good. We've had a fun conversation and chat today. Let me see here. A prince is a higher rank than duke. That's true. What was the real reason for the American Civil War? Slavery. The idea of the American Civil War was not about slavery and was about something else is one of the most absurd things I've ever heard, because at the end of the day, it all came down to the issue of slavery. The word fascist had a different meaning in the 1930s than what we understand. How would you agree? So, John, I think that we've overblown what a fascist is, and people who ever do anything we don't like and ever have political power is a fascist, or someone who's proposing certain things is a fascist. We've highly exaggerated what fascism is. Can you expand on how the Dutch helped America in the Revolutionary War? They were one of the first countries to recognize America's independence due to their connections to them and their desire to hurt the much more powerful navy of the English. They did contribute funds and weapons to the United States, not at the same rate as France or Spain. But yeah. BG, hello. Change the name to the history. Is it because of the Hugh Hefner stuff? No, I'm good. And you can be a friendly neighborhood historian too, Chandra, if you just subscribe. How old is USA, or when did Columbus arrive? Columbus arrived in 1492. The USA, the United States of America, was founded officially in 1776. Why was Jimmy Carter's term as president such a disaster, considering his career in Congress and the Senate was quite successful in his post-presidency? He wasn't a senator. He was in Congress shortly, and then he was a governor of Georgia. He was elected because he was a political insider, and everyone wanted that after the disaster of the Watergate. Carter's failure was he wanted to take on too much. He did not have a solution to the energy crisis, the rationing of gas, The economic stagnation of the 70s eventually caused a recession. And after the Iranian hostage crisis occurred, Carter's inability to deal swiftly with the Iranians and him being blamed for the fall of the friendly government of the Shah, albeit a despotic government of the Shah of Iran, made him look politically weak and is why he is still hated by many Iranian Americans to this day, Persian Americans. So yeah, he had an extremely successful post-presidency. I think the big problem with Jimmy Carter, and one of the reasons I find him fascinating, is you have high ideals from a man who really didn't know how to be an executive and expected other places of the world to, like the Soviets with the Afghan invasion, which also made him look weak, and the Ayatollahs in the Iranian Revolution to act with the same amount of decency and respectability that he acted with. So that's why you can have a great legacy post-presidency, because Jimmy Carter had many high ideals that he lived by. Look at all of his work for Habitat for Humanity, his work for global peace and the eradication of diseases. No one has done more to help the world other than probably Herbert Hoover than Jimmy Carter. Interestingly enough, Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter are the two presidents in U.S. history who saved more lives than any other U.S. president, and neither of them did it when they were actually in charge of the United States. The U.S. started making planes near the end of World War I. At the same time, the British got the Royal Air Force going. And I call it World War II, but I'll use World War I for the simple stuff. My neighbors like to, okay, no, love, loyalty, and success. That's not normal. That's unhealthy. Do a wellness check on them. Hi, can you explain how the USA won the Saratoga War? The Saratoga War? There was a battle at Saratoga. The Americans won it because Horatio Gates was backed up by Benedict Arnold's forces when Benedict Arnold was still fighting for the Americans. The arrogance of General John Burgoyne and the British, their surprising defeat at the hands of the Americans in Saratoga, brought the French into the war to help the Americans. Yeah, 1920s, and they weren't making a lot of them, and they were completely unprepared. Colonel William Marshall was court-martialed because he said the United States was so weak it would be attacked by the Japanese, and look what happened. Are the tariffs having an effect on China right now in the communist nation? I don't know how much effect they're having on China. The auspices of the tariffs are that China can't last as long as the Americans can with it. So, let me see. Fascists. The black shirts in the UK call themselves fascist. The British Union fascists. That's what I mean. Oh yeah, and a lot of people. And Churchill said the fascists of tomorrow will call themselves anti-fascists. Arthur St. Clair, I don't know who he is exactly. Jog my memory, and maybe I can share some thoughts on him. Jimmy Carter was out building houses at like 96. He was just a great person, but not a good president. Nice guys finish last. It sounds mean, but it's actually kind of true. BG, okay, because my history book in school said nothing when the planes were made. 1920s kind of starts in the 1910s, picking up following the imprint of the British Air Force. If you want to look at what was really incredible, look at the Tuskegee Airmen and how Tuskegee produced some of the greatest black pilots in American history. Bessie Coleman, the first African-American woman and Native American ever to have a pilot license. I mean, America just took off with flying in the 1920s. Bessie Coleman, Earhart, and of course, Charles Lindbergh. Jimmy Carter was a humanitarian that may not be so good for foreign policy as a president because you're not dealing with humanitarians, you're dealing with killers. Well said, Richard. Have you done live on India, Pakistan, or I missed? I've answered and talked about it a lot on the channel. I should probably do a live stream lecture about the distinction between India and Pakistan. I'd have to do some more research and the history of Kashmir, but that's a disputed area that is governed by both, just like the West Bank, and it's not pleasant to talk about. It's sad in many ways. You're very welcome, Incognito. Yeah, Pat, I think I would agree with you. China has so many levers to pull compared to Donald Trump. China would whip Donald Trump in a trade war. We'll see. We're in one, so. The problem is China does hold so many rare earth minerals, rare materials. Why the U.S. got the trade deal with Ukraine was just for that reason. And China has such a large amount of productivity, but it does depend on exporting. So obviously in exporting, getting those taxes on those goods coming in would hurt their economy. So what's the deal with taxes? Texas, do they ever surrender in the Civil War? Are they republic by herself? Can they become their own country? They can't become their own country, but they had their own country in the 1830s. The U.S. didn't want to admit them right after the Texas Revolution because Texas had slaves and the American president, Martin Van Buren, wasn't comfortable with another slave state. Yes, I do remember you, Gogo. Thank you for joining us again. I appreciate having you here. Because war is near between India, Pakistan, terrorists attacked on innocent. Yes, that's true, and both sides are pointing the finger at it. And Prime Minister Modi is running. His patience is wearing thin. It doesn't look like there will be war, but there's obviously a lot of concerns of war. Inflation hasn't hit China; it's hitting the U.S. China's economy is cracking forward, and China's load of new friends. So I think they're winning. I think that's a little early in the estimation. There might be some truth to that. China's economy is not as strong as it makes out. A lot of things about the Chinese society are not as strong as they make out. But yeah, it is true. It hasn't hit inflation hasn't hit them, and the inflation was already hitting the Americans, and it is hitting the U.S. now. We'll see. The economy is not good in America. The tariffs are certainly not helping, but it's not as bad as a lot of people thought it was going to be. Tell us who you are and what you do, and what are you doing here on YouTube Live. I just gave a live stream lecture on the history of the Dutch Republic and the Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century. I'm History Hefner, and this is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, where I bring you history in a friendly, neighborly manner, 24/7, 366, or 365. I do shorts every day. I do long form content every Monday and Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So yeah. And I do live stream lectures every Sunday at 4 and Q&As, Ask Me Anything. And when I finish my lecture, and now I'm just answering questions. Why did we give Hong Kong back when Hong Kong would have voted to stay with Britain? Pressure from the Chinese. Same reason that they have Tibet. Did you know that Hart and... yeah, Pog, I don't want that to be true. Wouldn't be horribly surprising when you understand how most men think, but yeah. I mean, the Chinese government can literally tell companies to take something when they do it, what they sell it for, and how much money to borrow. That's very true. They do have an inordinate amount of influence, so that's very true. I think, Harry, that's why he's doing it. He's trying to take away China's power to do that, and he thinks by taxing their exports and putting tariffs on their goods, and he thinks that by starting a trade war, he can weaken their economic standing in the world. And yes, Pog, I am very much a nerd. Thank you for joining us from Hungary. Beautiful country. I should do a live stream lecture on Hungary and the Magyar people. Very fascinating. Why did Nevada secede from the U.S. after the Civil War? I think it was a very brief secession. I don't know exactly why they did. They had just become a state just a few years before. So anyways, let's see here. Well, we are just over an hour. I will answer a couple more questions, but we're gonna I'm gonna sign off in a minute. Make sure to like and subscribe before you head out. We're just at about 40 likes, so I appreciate that. Liking and subscribing, even if you didn't already and you're already subscribed, you're then good. You're already a friendly neighborhood historian, but liking helps grow the appeal of the channel and gets more people on the channel and more eyes on this smoking jacket. So I know, I mean, like, he wishes he could have that much power over his country and his company like China does. Well, isn't that kind of like China being a dictatorship? Why is it called the United States if you're not allowed to leave it? You're allowed to leave the United States. In fact, you're allowed to leave every state. It's united in the sense that it's one country. I wish I got more education, but I got kicked out of college after getting, oh, well, who hasn't been in that position where they've gotten the wife of the dean pregnant? With a handle like that, Pog, I'm not very surprised. Tiffany, hi. Thank you for joining us. So if anyone, I'll take one more question from the audience, and then that'll be our last call. And then after that, I'm going to sign off, and I will see you guys again. We do this every Friday, 6 and every Saturday at 6. I answer all of your questions. Then Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern, it is a live stream lecture. A state is not allowed to leave the United States. Well, it would be it wouldn't be united if the states weren't allowed, and they are technically allowed. It just leads to ramifications. So the states have their own political power and rights that are given to them. So, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate you joining us, Dr. Who. And make sure to like and subscribe. But yeah, Harry's giving me the signal, and I will go with Harry on that one. I am not ethnically Dutch, but I love Dutch history. I love European history, but good guess. I appreciate that. And make sure to like and subscribe, Pog. Maybe we can get you back in college, keep the dean's wife safe, and get you a degree. Why did Germany start the war in Yugoslavia? They invaded Yugoslavia, and they were kicked out by the partisans under Tito in the Third World War. Would Hawaii be allowed to leave, considering it never voluntarily joined the Union, was not a state, it was annexed? Yes, it probably should be. I would say it should be, Harry. That's my last question I'm going to take for now. But join us on Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and have all your questions about history and social studies answered. Make sure that you've liked and subscribed. Thank you, Harry, and everyone else for a great time and a great conversation. Freshly, great job moderating. Show some love to my moderators before you guys head out. Follow those social medias and all of that great stuff. And yes, okay. Well, being history Hefner, I might know about that, but Pog, focus on the history. Yes, please push me on the president's horse, and I will push back. I'm looking forward to that. Take care. Have a wonderful week. And remember, love history. Bye-bye now.